we have a ton of rights and privileges and freedom, and we have generations of people who have fought to provide those rights and those freedoms. Sometimes we hold on to those freedoms and those rights more tightly than Jesus held on to his. Well, hello, and welcome to Sunday Morning with Hope Valley. I'm Pastor Sam. I'm the lead pastor of Hope Valley House Churches, and today we are continuing in our study through the book of Acts. We're actually picking up in Acts chapter 16, and before we get started into chapter 16, I just want to give you some introductory kind of information that will help you get caught up and just remember where we're at so far in the book of Acts and what's been going on. You know, in Acts chapter 15, really a big idea of that chapter was, and the main focus of that chapter really was the church kind of handling this first ever really significant doctrinal dispute. And it was about salvation and what does somebody need to do to be saved. And specifically, there were a group within the church that were, convinced that in order to be saved and be part of the family of God, you had to do everything that had always been required from the Jewish mindset, right? So following the law of Moses, men being circumcised, things like that. And so the elders and the apostles, they gathered to discuss this and work this out and come to some kind of an agreement and conclusion about that question. And the conclusion had been really clear. No, you do not need to be circumcised and follow the law of Moses in order to be saved and be part of the family of God. Actually, salvation comes completely by grace in Jesus Christ. And this is something that they came to the conclusion of after just weighing and considering what they had seen God do and what the Lord had taught them and what Jesus had taught them when he was with them. And so that was a really clear conclusion of Acts chapter 15. That's going to be important for today because now we are picking up with Paul and Silas. Paul is on his second missionary journey. Him and Barnabas had parted ways over a disagreement about who to take with them. We talked about that in the last lesson. And so now Paul and Silas are traveling together and they're revisiting the churches in the Galatian area that Paul and Barnabas had planted on their first missionary journey. And so that's kind of what's going on there. They're traveling back to checking on these new churches, see how they're doing, encourage them, strengthen them, that kind of a thing. So as we read today, we're going to be in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 5. Okay, and what we're going to be asking ourselves as we read this passage, the question I want you to have in your mind is the question: what matters more than your rights? Okay, that's the question for today. What matters more than your rights? Okay, so let's go ahead and pick up Acts chapter 16, verse 1 through 5. And it says here, Paul went on to Derbe and Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy. And he was the son of a believing Jewish woman, but his father was a Greek. And so the brothers and sisters at Lystra and Iconium spoke highly of him. And Paul wanted Timothy to go with him. So he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, since they all knew that his father was a Greek. And as they traveled through the towns, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem for the people to observe. And so the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they grew daily in numbers. All right. So what I want to do next is just kind of unpack some of the big ideas here, because I think just the simple, short little part that we read there is going to raise some questions, especially when we think about what we just covered in Acts chapter 15, right? But the first thing I want us to focus on is the fact that Timothy had a really good reputation, right? And we've actually seen this pointed out many other times about people in the book of Acts, and it's pointed out as something to look for, right? Barnabas, when we're introduced to Barnabas way back in Acts chapter 4, verse 36, we see that his name is actually Joseph, but the apostles call him Barnabas because it means son of encouragement. So at the same moment that we're introduced to Barnabas, we are also told the reputation that he has among the apostles. And then later in Acts chapter 6, when the apostles were having the people appoint some new leaders to take care of the ministry to the widows, one of the qualifications the apostles laid out was that these new leaders had to be men of good reputation in the community. So again, reputation is emphasized, right? And then even when we're learning about Cornelius back in Acts chapter 10, right, this Roman official who God is going to bring into the family of God, one of the first things we learn is that he had a good reputation amongst the people. So Luke points reputation out multiple times actually as you go through the book of Acts, and that's right because reputation is actually more important than maybe we think. And so the importance of reputation is actually going to be key to understanding this passage as we try to unpack what's going on here with Paul and Timothy, and Paul circumcising Timothy because, it says, of the other Jews. They all knew his father was a Greek, right? What's going on there? And the importance of reputation is going to be key to understanding that. Something we have to remember is that your ability to form new relationships with other people affects virtually every aspect of your life. And it's actually critically important for introducing people to Jesus, right? So good reputation opens doors to new relationships because people's first impression of you is almost always what they've heard from other people. What do other people say about you? And so reputation might not be something we think about a lot, but it's something we need to, especially in this passage, to understand what's going on. Because you don't want to be obsessed with your reputation, be overly concerned with what people think about you. But the reputation you have amongst people is critically important to forming relationships, and relationships are critically important to virtually every other aspect of life, including sharing the gospel. So we want to keep that in mind because we've got this question in front of us, right? And the question is Paul being hypocritical? Is he contradicting himself when he circumcises Timothy? Like, what's going on here, right? Is he caving to peer pressure? Because we already know that the elders had just said that circumcision was not needed to be saved. And yet here Paul is circumcising Timothy because of the way that it looks to the other Jewish men in the area, right? Even in his letter to the Galatians, which he wrote around this time, in Galatians chapter 5, verse 6, Paul told them that in Christ, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision accomplishes anything. So what is going on here? Why do we see Paul circumcising Timothy? Is he contradicting himself? Is he being hypocritical? Is he caving to peer pressure? The answer to all those questions is no, because the circumcision here was about reputation, and we'll unpack that. How is it affecting reputation? We'll talk about that here in a moment. But the circumcision was about reputation. It was not about salvation. So it's a different scenario here, right? So we want to understand this a little bit because Paul isn't caving or contradicting himself in the elder's decision. This circumcision that he's doing with Timothy is actually about removing barriers to relationship, right? You see, as a Jewish young man, because Timothy, even though his father was Greek, would have been counted as a Jewish young man because his mother was Jewish. That's the way it worked. And so being uncircumcised would have actually hurt Timothy's reputation among the very same Jewish men that Paul and Timothy were going to try and reach with the gospel, right? And so Paul is looking at Timothy and going, what are the things here? Here with you being uncircumcised, we have an unnecessary relational barrier that's going to hurt your reputation amongst these very same people we're trying to reach. And so that's actually what we're seeing here. This is a circumcision that's about reputation, about removing relational barriers, about opening doors to conversation and relationship building with people, right? That's what's going on here. And so the last kind of point I want us to think about here is that what we're seeing Timothy do is actually Timothy is laying down his rights in order to open doors. It doesn't seem like Paul forced this on Timothy, right? It says he took him and circumcised him because, that's the way that would work, right? Someone would do that to you. But it's not the language of Paul making Timothy do this. In fact, Timothy is probably learning from Paul actively in the middle of this process. But what we see here is actually Timothy laying down his rights. According to the Jerusalem Council, Timothy did not need to be circumcised. He didn't have to be circumcised. He was saved and was part of the family of God as he was. And yet we see him choosing, right? He didn't have to be circumcised. He chose to be circumcised. And one of the ideas I want us to think about is that we all have certain rights and privileges, but that holding those rights and privileges too tightly actually creates barriers to relationship when we hold those things too tightly, right? And so I think what we're seeing here is a lesson that Timothy is probably learning from Paul, right? And that lesson is that sometimes building a good reputation means laying down your rights. It means not being overly concerned with what you have to do, but concerned with what you ought to do, right? And so what we're seeing in this story is not hypocrisy, it's not contradiction. We're seeing Timothy choose to become like other Jewish men in order to connect with them. And kind of the last idea I want us to think about before we go to some questions for you to just ponder and discuss. As followers of Christ, we must follow his example of laying down our rights. Because this very same thing that we see Timothy doing, of choosing to lay down his rights in order to build relationship, in order to remove barriers, in order to build a reputation that will open doors with people. Timothy is laying down his rights. This is the same thing that we've learned and continue to learn from the example of Christ. Look at Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. This is chapter 2, verse 5 of Philippians. Paul writes, "Adopt the same attitude as that of Christ Jesus, who, existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Instead, he emptied himself." And then if you go to Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 and 17, it says, "Since the children have flesh and blood in common, Jesus also shared in these." He had to be, verse 17, he had to be like his brothers and sisters in every way so that he could become a merciful and faithful high priest. So we see Jesus completely giving up his rights and privileges, you could think of it that way, his rights and privileges and status as God, and emptying himself, Paul says to the Philippians, emptying himself in order to become just like us, in order to what? To build a bridge between God and man, right? And so in building relational bridges, Jesus laid down his rights and then sets an example for us on how we ought to also lay down our rights, right? And so that is thinking more deeply about the importance and the effect of reputation, especially in terms of our ability to build relationships with people, connect with them so that we can introduce them to Christ, share the gospel with them, and build that bridge, right? Is something that we're going to have to lay down our rights and our privileges in order to do very often. And so we can't be preoccupied with what we deserve, what we are entitled, what our rights are, and that kind of thing. And there will be many times when your own rights and entitlements are going to get in the way of an opportunity to connect with another person. And so when those moments arrive, we have to follow the example of Jesus, right? Because he laid down his rights and his privileges. He became like us in order to connect with us and to connect us to the Father, right? And so these are some big ideas, and got some questions here for you to just think about. If you're in a group setting, it'd be great to discuss these questions. If you by yourself, maybe journal on these, kind of discuss them, bring them up with some friends later this week and talk about them. But let me give you some questions to discuss with this, because the rights and privileges thing is something that we hold on to too much, and we can often be more concerned with what we have a right to do versus what we ought to do. Right? We're more concerned with what we deserve than we are with building bridges with other people. And especially in America, where we have a ton of rights and privileges and freedom, and we have generations of people who have fought to provide those rights and those freedoms, sometimes we hold on to those freedoms and those rights more tightly than Jesus held on to his. And so we're going to have to wrestle with, what does it look like in my own life to lay down those things in order to build bridges with people? And so here's some questions first. First, just think through, what stood out to you today's lesson. It's only 5 verses, but there's a lot going on there when you really think about it. So what stood out to you there? What kind of reputation should we have as Christians? That's a great thing for us to think about, maybe discuss. What kind of reputation should we have as Christians? And then a question for you to kind of take into this week is, what are some rights that you will lay down this week, right? What are some rights that you can lay down this week in order to connect with other people? Like you think about that, discuss that as well, if you're in a group. And so here's just kind of where I want to land the plane today, right? We have to reevaluate our attitude about our own rights and our own entitlements, right? And we have to follow Jesus' example of laying down our rights in order to build bridges with other people, right? And so kind of the last thing I'll leave you with today, just something maybe for you to pray about as you think about this today and this week. I just encourage you to ask the Lord to reveal areas of your life where you are holding on to your rights too tightly. Sometimes we can do that and maybe we don't even see how we're doing it. We don't even see where we're doing it. And so let's start by asking the Lord, are there rights, are there entitlements that I hold on to too tightly that are actually causing barriers to me building relationship and connecting with people for the purpose of bringing redemption and healing in the gospel into their life. And so pray through that this week. And then just a last reminder I'll give you, every week I have a devotional question, which we put together devotional on Wednesdays. You can find those at hopevalley.church/devo, that's D-E-V-O. If you go there, Tuesday, Wednesday usually is when I post those. And it just is a little devotional, a little question to help you go a little bit deeper with the lesson. It's midweek and you can just kind of revisit and just go a little bit deeper with it. The question I have for this week is, what are some areas of your life where you're focusing more on what you have to do than on what you ought to do? And so we'll talk about that more in this week's devotional. But in the meantime, just pray on those things. I just encourage you to think deeply about those things today. Hope this has been a blessing for you, and hope that you'll continue with us as we study through the book of Acts. In the meantime, have a blessed day. All right, bye.
We are so glad you have joined us today. To learn more about Hope Valley Church and get access to free resources, just go to www.hopevalley.church. There, you will also find links to connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, as well as links to our podcasts, now available on Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please take a moment to like and subscribe so you can stay up with new videos coming out every week. Hope Valley is a church based in Winchester, Virginia that meets in homes around the region. So if you'd like to find out more about home churches, how they work, and how to locate one near you, just go to hopevalley.church/house. Thanks again for joining us, and may God bless you today.